Folks, I watched Donald Trump's declaration of a national emergency so he could proceed with building his border wall. There are a couple points that need to be made. I try to view things objectively. I don't see myself as being on one team in American politics or another. I try to view things objectively and talk about what is best for the world, what is best for the country. I'm obviously very, very, very critical of the Trump administration, and so I'm going to make a couple points. Now, the first point I want to make is regarding this.
We want to stop drugs from coming into our country. We want to stop criminals and gangs from coming into our country. Nobody's done the job that we've ever done. I mean, nobody's done the job that we've done on the border. That's the story. We want to have a safe country. I ran on a very simple slogan: make America great again. If you're going to have drugs pouring across the border, if you're going to have human traffickers pouring across the border in areas where we have no protection, in areas where we don't have a barrier.
Right. Now, Donald Trump is absolutely correct when he points out that these organizations that operate along the U.S. border, that ship in heroin and drugs into the country, that are involved in human trafficking, are just vile, vile groups. They're engaging in horrendous activities. But it must be said that in his administration, his special representative for Venezuela, Elliott Abrams, is an individual who is deeply tied in with those very organizations. Elliott Abrams was tied to the extremist and terrorist forces in Nicaragua that worked against the Sandinista government. Elliott Abrams was tied in with the forces in Colombia and the paramilitaries that were involved in the drug trade and fighting against the FARC, the Marxist FARC revolutionary group. And furthermore, you can go down the line. Elliott Abrams was tied into massacres in El Salvador. He was tied into crimes in Guatemala. You know, Elliott Abrams has very, very deep ties to these drug-dealing, kidnapping, murdering groups that the U.S. government has supported all throughout Latin America, all throughout South and Central America. There has been massive support by the United States for extremists, drug dealers, and terrorists in the name of stopping socialism and communism. Every time a government emerges in Latin America that tries to build infrastructure and raise the people up out of poverty, the USA funds terrorists and extremists to go in there and tear it down in the name of supposedly defending democracy. This is a pattern that we have seen over and over and over again. And Elliott Abrams, who was actually convicted for lying to Congress, about the funding of these groups, is now in the Trump administration. So it absolutely must be said that there's a big problem here, and that for Trump to just make it out like this is just the way these countries naturally are, to not talk about the actual causes here, and to just use it to scaremonger in order to get his wall, it's very, very disingenuous. And that absolutely must be said. Now, this next part where Trump talks about China, I wanted to get to that.
And when I asked President Xi, I said, do you have a drug problem? No, no, no. I said, you have 1.4 billion people. What do you mean you have no drug problem? No, we don't have a drug problem. I said, why? Death penalty. We give death penalty to people that sell drugs. End of problem. What do? We set up blue ribbon committees. Lovely men and women. They sit around a table, they have lunch, they eat, they dine, and they waste a lot of time. So if we want to get smart, we can get smart. You can end a drug problem. You can end it a lot faster than you think. But President Xi's agreed to put fentanyl on his list of deadly drugs. And it's a criminal penalty, and the penalty is death. So that's, frankly, one of the things I'm most excited about in our trade deal.
So you have Donald Trump talking about China, right? And that President Xi says the reason they have no drug problem in China is because of the death penalty. Well, that's a very simplistic answer, and it is true that in China they are very harsh on drug importers, drug dealers, and all of that, because China has done a huge amount to eradicate the drug problem. When China was not a socialist country, when it was a capitalist country, after the 2 opium wars the British waged and forced them to be part of the British capitalist free market, right? When Adam Smith economics and neoliberalism was forced on the people of China by the British and by the Americans, after we sent our forces there to put down the nationalist Boxer Rebellion, right? During the early parts of the 20th century, China was a free market country. British bankers were in there, German bankers were in there, American bankers were in there, heroin and drugs were everywhere. But in 1949, when the Chinese people stood up and the Chinese Communist Party took power, they immediately eradicated the drug trade. It was one of their biggest campaigns to get rid of drug addiction, and they offered treatment to heroin addicts, they offered recovery, they did all kinds of things, but they executed drug importers, they executed people that were working with the British and with the Americans to bring in heroin, and China was able to cure itself, essentially, of this huge drug problem by taking control of their economy. Socialism with Chinese characteristics has been able to stop the importing of drugs into China. And that needs to be acknowledged. Yes, they do have the death penalty in China. They have the death penalty in many countries, in relation to drugs. But the reason that China has been able to have such achievements is because they have a socialist government. The reason we can't get over our drug problem in the United States is because our government is tied in very closely with forces around the world that are dealing drugs. If you look at the facts, right? HSBC Bank, one of the big Wall Street banks, was basically set up to bring heroin and opioids into China. Right, you can go down the line with CIA connections to narco groups in Latin America. That our government doesn't want to end the drug epidemic. The drug epidemic, it makes lots of money for the prison industrial complex. It makes lots of money for the recovery programs. It makes lots of money. It's a big money maker. This war on drugs hasn't worked, and the reason that it hasn't worked is because there's so much money for Wall Street involved. China has been able to overcome its drug problem by breaking out of the capitalist Western system. By seizing control of the major centers of economic power, by planning their economy, China has been able to really, really basically wipe out their drug problem. And they've been harsh about it. And the death penalty is a big part of their anti-drug policy, but there's an economic component. We are run by a group of billionaires and bankers here in the United States who really don't have an incentive to get rid of the drug trade. The Chinese Communist Party, on the other hand, is based among communities and organizations of people, and they have a real interest in raising China up out of poverty and eradicating the drug problem. Now, there's one more point that Donald Trump made in his remarks that I think I'd like to address.
So I'm going to be signing a national emergency, and it's been signed many times before. It's been signed by other presidents. From 1977 or so, it gave the presidents the power. There's rarely been a problem. They sign it. Nobody cares. I guess they weren't very exciting. But nobody cares. They sign it for far less important things in some cases, in many cases.
Now, this point is important because, yes, I don't agree with building the wall, but to be fair, this National Emergency Act of 1976 has been invoked 58 times. And at this point, there are 31 different national emergencies that are in effect, right? That the President of the United States has 31 times declared a national emergency, and each of these 31 are renewed, right? And there are 58 totals. Some of them have expired, but 31 national emergencies are still in effect. And what are these national emergencies? Well, national emergencies were declared by U.S. President Bush against Belarus and against the socialist president Alexander Lukashenko, against Zimbabwe. Obama declared national emergencies against Libya, against Syria. I mean, all kinds of governments have been targeted by these national emergencies that the U.S. president has the right to invoke under the 1976 National Emergency Act. And so why does Trump legally not have the right to do the same thing around the U.S. border? This National Emergency Act ought to be gotten rid of, right? It gives way too much power to the executive branch. Legally, under the National Emergency Act, Trump has the legal right to do what he's doing. However, what he's doing is not right, and I think Trump should be stopped from building this wall. And furthermore, I think that all of these National Emergency Acts that have been implemented, all of the sanctions that have been imposed on independent and socialist countries around the world under the National Emergency Act should be gotten rid of. And I really wish that the left had spoken up and opposed all these national emergencies that were declared in order to give the executive branch of the government the power, essentially, to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do if this law didn't exist. The National Emergency Act gives the president the ability to basically unilaterally impose sanctions and take dramatic actions without Congress's approval. Trump building his wall is done with the same legal coding through which all kinds of independent countries like Venezuela, like Iran, have been attacked. The longest standing national emergency ever declared was when Jimmy Carter declared the Islamic Republic of Iran, their revolution, to be a national emergency and froze all the assets. And it wasn't until Obama came in that they finally rescinded that national emergency. Trump legally has the right to do what he's doing. I don't think he should do it. I think this wall is really stupid. It's a waste of money, and it's pandering to anti-immigrant bigotry, fear of immigrants, and not addressing the real issue. But let's talk about the National Security Act, the National Emergency Act, and what it really is. There's no real conversation here. The anti-Trump hysterics are kind of childish. Let's talk about what's actually going on here and how there's plenty of blame to go around. And in essence, Donald Trump is using a law that has often been used by the liberal establishment against independent governments.